both the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency have said we have a possible crisis here as long as the Russians continue to occupy the plant and use it as a military base.
Now, we're into day 167 of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but you could be forgiven for not being completely up to date. The situation is complicated, it's depressing, and it's been going on now since February, with seemingly no end in sight. Although it may have somewhat dropped off our front pages, we wanted to bring you an update of the situation. Scott Lucas is Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham and founder of EA Worldview. Good morning, Scott.
Very good morning to you, Emma.
Good morning, Professor Lucas. Can you start by giving our listeners an update of the general situation, a sort of background, because it has dropped somewhat down our front pages?
Well, Emma, we started off thinking back in February that this might be a quick operation, that Russia would sweep into Kyiv and topple the Zelensky government. And having failed to do that, in fact, having had to withdraw from northern Ukraine, we're now into the long war, the long conflict. It's being fought inside the country on two fronts. The Russians are still trying to grab territory in the east, what's called the Donbass region, but Ukraine, bolstered by military assistance from the international community, especially the US, is now waging a counteroffensive in the south, taking back part of the area that Russia seized in the opening days of the invasion. So while you have this ongoing military conflict, you also have the other dimensions. You have the economic dimension, with the sanctions really squeezing Russia and limiting its ability to continue to pursue the invasion. And then you have really the fight for hearts and minds, if you want to call it that. You have a lot of Russian disinformation there. You have a lot of people in the West actually carrying out Russia lines and falsehoods. And meanwhile, Ukraine is trying to cut through that and say, no, we're the ones who are being attacked here. We're the ones who need accountability and justice, not only over the invasion, but over the war crimes that have been committed against our people.
I wanted to ask you about the status of Zaporizhzhia. This is the Russian-occupied nuclear power plant, and I know you've been writing about that in detail on EA Worldview. Tell me a little bit more. What's going on there?
Well, the immediate issue with Zaporizhzhia, which is the largest nuclear complex in Europe, it has 6 nuclear reactors, is that the Russian military occupied the site in the first days of the war when they took part of the south. Now, okay, they hold the plant. The plant actually continues to operate with Ukrainian technicians. The first issue is that the Russians have been firing from that plant across the Dnipro River, which is the biggest river in Ukraine, at a city called Nikopol. Now, the Russians have been firing on Nikopol and have been doing it for weeks in the belief that no one can respond, because who would fire back and possibly
It's mined.
set up
They've
an
mined the
accident?
power plant, haven't they?
Yeah, they've mined the power plant to
Right.
make sure that the Ukrainians can't overrun it, but also the Ukrainians can't fire artillery back at the plant because they might actually damage a reactor, and you know what that might cause. Now, the situation's escalated in the last few days because the Ukrainians say that the Russians, possibly to cut power to Ukrainians in the area, possibly to try to blame Ukraine to set up what we call a false flag, have actually shelled the area around the nuclear plant, and they've damaged electrical lines. And when you damage electrical lines, you could possibly cut off power to the plant, and that could set off a reaction in the reactors. So both the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency have said we have a possible crisis here as long as the Russians continue to occupy the plant and use it as a military base.
So it's a really delicate situation there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are delicate situations across Ukraine. But if you think back to the fact that this was the site where Chernobyl occurred,
Yeah.
which of course was an accident rather than a military conflict, but you think about, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives that were affected by that, even to this day, damaging one of those reactors in southern Ukraine could set off another Chernobyl, 35 years later.
And you mentioned earlier that that position on two military fronts, you've got the Ukraine counteroffensive in the south and then Russian operations in the east. Give us more of a sort of geographical sense of what's going on there.
Well, the East has actually been the position of what you might call the long war, which is after Ukrainians overthrew the pro-Russian president in 2014 over corruption, over his ties to Moscow. Russia fought back by using its people to seize part of the East, what we call the Donbass. And now they want to take more of it. Now they've taken almost all of a province called Luhansk, and they're trying to take the Donetsk province next door, but they're running into real problems. They've had problems throughout the war with supplies, with logistics, with troops. They've lost 1/3 of their force. So that, even taking a small bit of territory is proving to be difficult. And meanwhile, in the south, Ukraine, especially because they have what's called these HIMARS rocket systems, they're destroying Russian positions, ammunition depots, logistical positions, and key bridges. And they could be in a position to take the Kherson province, which borders the Black Sea. Very, very strategically important. So I think you've got a window, Emma, which is if Ukraine can actually fight back, really within the next 4 months, because the next 4 months are crucial, because then when we get into winter, Vladimir Putin plays his last card. If he can't take more territory, if he can't break the will of the Ukrainians, if he can't stop the military aid, he's going to try to freeze us. He's going to try to say, don't support Kiev, or if you keep supporting them, you won't get oil and gas. And let's see how you cope with your increased heating cost and huddling under your blankets.
Gosh, if we're worrying about winter here, you just imagine what people are feeling in Ukraine and Russia. Scott, tell me about these latest Russian war crimes that have been caught on video. You've been writing about that as well.
Yes. Now, again, Emma, there's a real broader context in which we're talking about thousands, possibly tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians who have been killed by Russian forces. We're talking about, the Ukrainians say up to 2 million who've been forcibly deported from Ukraine. But what has brought this home in the last couple of weeks have been a series of murders, and they are murders on video of Ukrainian POWs. Videos that I would not dare show on my website. Yeah. Of Ukrainian prisoners of war who have been killed, who've been beheaded, who have been castrated, sort of as a just simply an act of brutality, but also again to break the will to resist. And then you have this incident, which is still we're attempting to investigate it, but the Russians are preventing it, where you had an explosion at a detention center in eastern Ukraine, which killed 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war. Now, the Russians immediately tried to say, the Ukrainian military had shelled its own prisoners of war. They attacked this. But the evidence that we can get, and we are limited because we can't get access to the site, is that, in fact, Russia may have actually set off an explosion inside this detention center to deliberately kill these prisoners.
Absolutely appalling. What can you tell us about Putin? What's the latest there? Are we hearing anything? Do we know what he's up to?
Well, I think there have been hopes that, perhaps the war could be curbed because, initially we thought, would Russians support this war, especially when the sanctions were imposed, when they paid a cost for it. But I think Putin is dug in, and I don't think Russians, a lot of them do support this war. You have to acknowledge that. I don't think even if they oppose it, they have the capacity to remove him. I think the inner circle are still there around Putin. We had the idea that maybe Putin had serious health issues, the possibility of Parkinson's disease. But I think intelligence agencies say they don't think that is on the cards, at least preventing him from falling from power or having to leave in the near future. I think we have to accept the fact that Putin, this is his lifetime's work, as it were. He wanted to make Ukraine part of greater Russia. He has failed to do that because of the Ukrainian people, first and foremost, and the resistance of the Ukrainian government and military. But he still will try to take as much of Ukraine as he thinks he can grab. So this idea, which is being pushed, including by a lot of people in the West who portray themselves as experts, including a fellow named Henry Kissinger, that you can just negotiate with the Russians, that there's a diplomatic route out of this at this point. No, there isn't. Putin doesn't want to negotiate. Putin wants to take part of Ukraine, and if he can't do it, he wants to inflict as much damage as possible.
Professor Lucas, thank you. I was going to end by asking you, are there any glimmers of hope? But I think you've given us a pretty comprehensive view of the situation. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. That's Professor Scott Lucas, Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham and founder of EA Worldview.